Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The April morning was cold and gray when Heather Bogle clocked out of her shift at the Whirlpool manufacturing plant in Clyde, Ohio. It was just after 6 in the morning on April 9th, 2015, and the 28-year-old single mother had worked through the night, as she always did. Security cameras captured her walking across the parking lot toward her car, a routine she had followed countless times before. She wore the fatigue of a night shift worker, but also the quiet determination of a mother who would soon pick up her daughter from school. Heather had no way of knowing that these would be her final steps as a free woman, that the coming hours would transform her from a hard-working mother into a victim whose name would echo through the corridors of Ohio's justice system for years to come. Heather lived in Ballville Township, not far from the plant where she earned her living. She was raising her young daughter Mackenzie alone, navigating the challenges of single motherhood with the same resilience that defined her character. Those who knew her described a woman who fought for what she believed in, who stood her ground even when circumstances turned against her. That morning, as she drove away from Whirlpool, she had recently failed a nursing exam, a setback that weighed on her mind. The disappointment was fresh, but Heather was not one to give up easily. She had plans, dreams of a better future for herself and her daughter. But when the school day ended and Mackenzie waited for her mother to arrive, Heather never came. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages sat unread. The hours stretched into an agonizing evening as family members tried desperately to reach her. Something was terribly wrong. Heather was the kind of mother who never missed picking up her child, the kind of woman whose absence meant only one thing. She had not chosen to disappear. The following day, April 10th, 2015, brought the nightmare into sharp, devastating focus. Heather's car was discovered in the parking lot of the Somerton Apartments in Sandusky County. Investigators approached the vehicle with growing dread, their training preparing them for possibilities they hoped would not materialize. When they opened the trunk, those hopes shattered completely. Inside lay Heather's lifeless body, curled in a semi-fetal position that made her appear almost peaceful, almost as though she were sleeping. But this was no peaceful rest. The oversized red Mickey Mouse t-shirt she wore did not belong to her, a detail that would haunt investigators for months. Someone had dressed her in this garment, someone who had tried to create an illusion, to stage a scene. Her hair had been brutally chopped off at the scalp, hacked away with what appeared to be a pocket knife, leaving jagged remnants where her hair had once been. Her fingernails had been cut down to the cuticles, meticulously trimmed in what investigators immediately recognized as an attempt to destroy evidence. The autopsy revealed the full horror of what Heather had endured. She had been shot twice in the back, the bullets penetrating vital organs in her chest. But the gunshots had come only after she had suffered tremendously. Her hands bore defensive wounds, evidence that she had raised them to protect herself, that she had blocked blows and fought against her attacker with every ounce of strength she possessed. The wounds told a story of someone who refused to surrender, who battled against impossible odds even as she was being overpowered. After her death, someone had cleaned her body with meticulous care, washing away blood and evidence in a calculated effort to cover their tracks. The car itself held no blood, no bullet holes. Heather had been killed elsewhere, and her body transported to this location, placed in the trunk and abandoned. The staging, the cleaning, the cutting of hair and nails, all of it pointed to a killer who understood forensic evidence, who knew what investigators would look for, and had taken deliberate steps to eliminate it. Detective Sean O'Connell of the Sandusky County Sheriff's Office took the lead on the investigation. He began by examining Heather's personal life, looking for conflicts or relationships that might have turned deadly. He learned that Heather had been in a relationship with a woman named Carmela Badillo, and that there had been some kind of verbal argument between them just before Heather's disappearance. But after reviewing phone records and conducting interviews, O'Connell determined that Carmela could not have been the killer. The detective's attention then shifted to a woman named Kiona Bohr. She lived near the apartment complex where Heather's body had been found, a geographical connection that O'Connell found suspicious. He began building a theory, one that would eventually pull in two other individuals, Omar Satchel and Carrie Jeffrey. O'Connell believed he had discovered a conspiracy, that these three people had worked together to kill Heather Bogle. According to O'Connell's theory, Omar sometimes sold Heather marijuana and may have stolen a small caliber firearm. The detective claimed that a source told him Carrie Jeffrey had disposed of the murder weapon by throwing it into a river. Based on this information, O'Connell launched a dive team to search the water, hoping to recover the gun. He also pointed to Kiona's Facebook posts, which he interpreted as confessions of guilt. In one post, he claimed she wrote about not believing what had just happened, and in another she mentioned serving time for murder and pleading insanity. O'Connell was so convinced of his theory that he publicly named Kiona, Omar, and Carrie as suspects in the newspaper. The consequences for these individuals were immediate and devastating. Kiona lost her job and her apartment. She had to pull her son out of school as strangers sent her hateful messages, calling her a monster and saying she and her children deserved to die. Her reputation was destroyed, her life upended by accusations that would prove to be entirely false. Because underneath all of O'Connell's certainty lay a critical piece of evidence that contradicted everything he believed. DNA had been found under Heather's cuticle, genetic material that her defensive struggle had preserved. When that DNA was tested, it did not match Omar Satchel. It did not match Carrie Jeffrey. It did not match Kiona Bohr. The three people O'Connell had publicly accused, the three lives he had torn apart, were innocent. For more than a year, O'Connell pursued his flawed theory, even as the scientific evidence pointed elsewhere. He ignored leads that did not fit his narrative. When a Whirlpool employee sent him an email shortly after Heather's murder, telling him she knew someone capable of this crime, and pointing toward a co-worker named Daniel Myers, O'Connell never followed up. He was too fixated on his three suspects to see what was hiding in plain sight. But O'Connell had done more than simply pursue the wrong theory. An investigation into his conduct revealed that he had lied. He had falsified police reports. He had tampered with evidence. He had tried to manufacture a case that did not exist and push it through the system despite knowing the truth. In July 2018, Sean O'Connell accepted a plea deal and admitted to evidence tampering. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, a detective who had once hunted criminals now becoming one himself. By the time O'Connell was held accountable, a new sheriff had taken charge of Sandusky County. Sheriff Chris Hilton looked at the Heather Bogle case and saw what should have been obvious from the beginning. This was a solvable crime, but only if the investigation was conducted properly. He reopened the case completely, treating every person as a suspect until they could be eliminated through proper police work. Hilton and his team went back to the fundamentals. They examined Heather's social media accounts and email, looking for patterns and connections. They obtained her GPS data from the day she disappeared, tracking the digital footprints she had left behind. The electronic trail led them to a trailer home just a few miles from the Whirlpool plant. The residence belonged to Daniel Myers, a 49-year-old man who had worked at Whirlpool alongside Heather. Myers had clocked out around the same time as Heather on the morning she vanished. When investigators looked closer, they found that Heather's phone had last pinged at Myers' trailer on April 9th, the day she went missing. This was the last known location of her device before it went silent forever. The DNA found under Heather's cuticle, the genetic material she had fought so hard to preserve, matched Daniel Myers. It was the evidence that had been there all along, waiting for someone to follow it to its logical conclusion. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Myers' trailer and discovered evidence that painted a chilling picture. Floorboards had been replaced less than a week after Heather's death. The old boards had been removed and new ones installed, likely to eliminate traces of blood or bullet holes. Myers had also purchased a new mattress at the end of April, disposing of the one that had been in his home when Heather was killed. These were not the actions of an innocent man. Further investigation revealed that Myers had 2 damaged teeth, one cracked and one broken, that he had repaired with superglue. Prosecutor Tim Braun believed these injuries occurred during Heather's fierce struggle for survival, evidence that she had landed blows against her attacker even as he overpowered her. Perhaps most disturbing were Myers' actions after the murder. He had attended Heather's calling hours at the funeral home, standing among the grieving family and friends as though he were just another mourner. He had contributed $125 to the GoFundMe account established to support Heather's daughter Mackenzie. He had even driven to the Somerton apartments on the night Heather's body was discovered, approaching the scene while investigators worked and witnesses gathered. People who saw him there told investigators he was acting strangely, asking whether Heather was still wearing certain clothing. He was returning to admire his work, to insert himself into the investigation, to experience the chaos he had created. When investigators interviewed women who had known Myers, a pattern of violence emerged. Multiple women came forward to report that Myers had become violent with them during intimate encounters and abusive in relationships. One particularly haunting connection surfaced from Myers' past. In 2009, his ex-girlfriend Lee Ann Sluter had died under suspicious circumstances while living in a trailer next to his at Emerald Estates. Her death had been ruled a suicide by gunshot from a rifle, but her family never believed she would have taken her own life. The questions surrounding Sluter's death remained unanswered, but they cast an even darker shadow over Daniel Myers. On June 2017, Daniel Myers was arrested and charged with Heather Bogle's murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His DNA under her fingernails, her phone's location at his trailer, the replaced floorboards, the new mattress, his damaged teeth, his suspicious behavior after the crime. Prosecutors prepared to seek the death penalty, ready to argue that Myers deserved the ultimate punishment for what he had done. Faced with the mountain of evidence, Myers made a choice. Rather than face trial and the possibility of execution, he agreed to plead guilty in exchange for prosecutors removing the death penalty from consideration. On February 13, 2019, nearly 4 years after Heather's murder, Daniel Myers stood in the Sandusky County Courthouse in Fremont, Ohio, and admitted to killing her. The details that emerged during the proceedings were horrifying. Prosecutor Tim Braun laid out what he believed had happened based on the evidence. When Heather arrived at Myers' trailer that April morning, he likely came onto her in a manner that was unwelcome and aggressive. Heather, who had just failed her nursing exam and was dealing with her own disappointments, apparently laughed at him or rejected his advances. Her rejection triggered a violent rage. Myers grabbed her, and Heather fought back immediately, punching him hard enough to crack and break his teeth. But Myers was physically stronger. He beat her into submission, overpowered her struggling body, and placed handcuffs on her wrists. Even restrained, the assault continued. He stripped her and moved her to his bed, where the torture extended for what must have felt like an eternity to Heather. The defensive wounds on her hands showed she never stopped trying to protect herself, never stopped fighting for her life and for the daughter who waited for her. When Myers finally ended Heather's suffering, he shot her twice in the back. Then came the cleanup. He washed her body meticulously, trying to remove any trace evidence. He dressed her in the oversized Mickey Mouse t-shirt. He cut off her hair and trimmed her fingernails down to the cuticles, attempting to destroy the DNA evidence she had captured during her fight. But he could not get it all. Beneath those cuticles, invisible to his eye, remained the genetic material that would ultimately identify him as her killer. Myers curled Heather's body into the trunk of her car and drove to the Somerton apartments, arranging her in that heartbreaking pose that resembled a sleeping child. He abandoned her there and returned to his life, replacing the floorboards and mattress that held evidence of his crime, attending her funeral, donating to her daughter's fund, all while 3 innocent people suffered under the weight of false accusations. At his sentencing hearing, Myers listened as the consequences of his actions were detailed. The court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, no chance of freedom, no opportunity to harm another woman. Heather's family finally had answers, but those answers came with the unbearable knowledge of what she had endured. Her sister Jennifer spoke at the proceedings, her pain evident as she confronted not only Myers but also the detective whose misconduct had delayed justice. Carmela Badillo, Heather's former girlfriend who had herself been suspected before being cleared, also attended to see justice served. Sheriff Chris Hilton, reflecting on the case, emphasized what had made it solvable in the end. It was Heather herself who provided the key evidence. Her refusal to give up, her determination to fight even when she knew she might not survive, had preserved the DNA that identified her killer. In her final moments, facing unimaginable terror, Heather Bogle had found a way to speak for herself, to leave behind the truth that would eventually set the record straight. The case left scars on Sandusky County that extended far beyond Heather's immediate family. 3 innocent people had been publicly accused and had their lives destroyed by a detective who tampered with evidence and pursued a false theory. The real killer had walked free for more than 2 years while the investigation focused on the wrong suspects. The criminal justice system had failed in multiple ways before finally, slowly, correcting its course. For Mackenzie, Heather's daughter, the verdict meant growing up without her mother. The GoFundMe account that Daniel Myers had contributed to was meant to support her future, a future that would forever be shaped by her mother's absence. The oversized Mickey Mouse t-shirt, the chopped hair, the clean body, all of Myers' attempts to obscure the truth had ultimately failed because Heather had fought back. In the end, this case became a testament to resilience and persistence. Heather's resilience in fighting for her life even when death seemed certain. The resilience of her family in demanding answers when the initial investigation went astray. The persistence of Sheriff Hilton in reopening a case that others might have considered too compromised to solve. And the persistence of truth itself, which emerged despite tampering, despite false accusations, despite the passage of time. The surveillance footage of Heather walking across the Whirlpool parking lot that April morning remained, a final image of a woman who had no idea what awaited her. She was just trying to get home, just trying to pick up her daughter from school, just trying to live her life. Daniel Myers took all of that away from her, but he could not take away her final act of defiance. In fighting back, in refusing to be an easy victim, Heather Bogle ensured that justice would eventually find its way to her door. On February 13, 2019, when Myers was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison, that justice finally belatedly arrived. Story 2. The warm evening of January 5, 2020, held no warnings for Wanter Jabulal Dlamini as she sat sharing drinks with people she considered friends in Barberton, a small town in the Mjindini district of Mpumalanga, South Africa. At 62 years old, Wanter had lived through decades of South African history, raising her daughters through challenging times and working hard to build a life for her family. She was a mother, a friend, and a woman who trusted those closest to her. But on that ordinary summer evening, as she lifted her glass and shared conversation with familiar faces, she could not have known that the beer she drank had been poisoned or that those around her were already counting the hours until her death. Among the people in Wanter's company that night were individuals who should have protected her above all others. Her own daughters, Valencia Nanlanlam Thunua and Bethabil Penelope Thunua, were part of the gathering. Also present was Nambuso Philadelphia Ndwandwa, a woman who would later be revealed as a key architect of the conspiracy. The group appeared relaxed, enjoying drinks together as the evening wore on. But beneath the surface of this seemingly innocent social gathering, a sinister plot was already in motion, driven by a motive as old as crime itself, greed. 2 months earlier, in November 2019, Nambuso Ndwandwa had taken out an insurance policy in Wanter's name with Old Mutual, one of South Africa's largest insurance companies. The policy was worth 80,000 rand, almost $4,500, a substantial sum that would be paid out in the event of Warner's death. Critically, Warner herself knew nothing about this policy. She had not signed the documents, had not agreed to the terms, and had no idea that her own life had been assigned a monetary value by people she trusted. The policy was fraudulent from its inception, but it served as the foundation for what would follow. A carefully orchestrated plan to murder Wanter and claim the insurance money. As the evening of January 5th progressed, the poison that had been slipped into Warner's drink began to take effect. The exact substance used was never publicly disclosed in court records, but its purpose was clear: to weaken Wanter, to make her vulnerable, to ensure that what came next would be easier to execute. Wanter may have felt ill, may have experienced nausea or dizziness, but she likely attributed these sensations to natural causes. She had no reason to suspect that her own children were involved in poisoning her. The following day, January 6, 2020, Valencia made an invitation that would seal her mother's fate. She asked Wanter to come to the house of her boyfriend, Steen Silo Mashaking. It seemed like a simple request, the kind of invitation a daughter might extend to her mother for a visit or a meal. Wanter accepted, trusting her daughter completely. She arrived at the house unaware that she was walking into a trap that had been meticulously planned by multiple people, including her own blood. What happened inside that house remains one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. The details, as they emerged during the investigation and trial, painted a picture of unimaginable cruelty. Wanter was assaulted, her body subjected to violence by people who had conspired to end her life. An act of violation that served no purpose in the plan to claim insurance money, but revealed the depths of depravity to which her killers had sunk. Finally, she was strangled, her life slowly squeezed away as she struggled and fought until she could fight no more. The woman who had given life to Valencia and Beithabeel died at their hands, or at least with their full knowledge and participation. After Wanter's death, her killers faced the problem of disposing of her body. They could not simply leave her in the house where she had been murdered. That would immediately point investigators toward them. So they transported her body to a local dumping area near the abattoir, a place where garbage and waste were discarded. They left Wanter there among the refuse, treating her remains with the same disregard they had shown her life. It was a final indignity, a statement of how little value they placed on the woman who had raised them. For a brief time, it seemed the plan might succeed. Wanter's body was discovered at the dumping site, but the circumstances of her death were initially unclear. However, what the conspirators had not fully anticipated was how quickly their fraud would unravel once they attempted to claim the insurance money. Within days of Wanter's death, a claim was submitted to Old Mutual. The claim came from Wanter's daughters, Valencia and Beithabeel, seeking the 80,000 rand payout from the policy that Nambuso Ndwandwe had fraudulently taken out in their mother's name. Insurance fraud has become an increasingly serious problem in South Africa, with multiple high-profile cases emerging in recent years of family members murdering their relatives to claim insurance benefits. Insurance companies have responded by implementing more rigorous investigation procedures, and Old Mutual was no exception. When the claim for Wanter's policy came through so soon after her death, it triggered scrutiny. Investigators began asking questions. How had Wanter died? When had the policy been taken out? Who were the beneficiaries? As these questions multiplied, the police became involved. The South African Police Service launched a thorough investigation into Wanter's death. Detectives interviewed witnesses, examined the crime scene, and traced the financial trail left by the fraudulent insurance policy. The evidence began to point in an unmistakable direction, toward Wanter's own daughters and their co-conspirators. The police discovered that Nambuso Ndwandwe had been the one to arrange the insurance policy without Wanter's knowledge. They learned about the gathering on January 5th, where Wanter's beer had been poisoned. They uncovered testimony about Valencia's invitation to her boyfriend's house the following day. Piece by piece, the conspiracy came into focus. for people were arrested and charged in connection with Wanter's murder. Valencia Nanlanlam Thunua, aged 33 at the time of her eventual conviction, faced charges of murder, attempted murder, fraud, theft, rape, conspiracy to commit murder, and defeating the ends of justice. Her sister, Bathabil Penelope Thunua, aged 39, faced the same array of charges. Nambuso Philadelphia Ndwandwa, aged 41, the woman who had orchestrated the fraudulent insurance policy, was also arrested and charged. Finally, Steen Silo Mashaking, aged 35, Valencia's boyfriend in whose house the murder had taken place, was taken into custody. The case made its way through the South African legal system, a process that would take several years. The accused were initially brought before the Mbambila Magistrates Court, where they faced preliminary hearings. The gravity of the charges meant that the case would ultimately be heard in the Mpumalanga Division of the High Court, where more serious criminal matters are adjudicated. As the trial date approached, the accused prepared their defense strategies. Some maintained their innocence. Others began to consider whether cooperation with prosecutors might result in more favorable outcomes. The trial was scheduled to begin in January 2024, nearly 4 years after Wanter's death. By this time, one of the accused had made a decision that would fundamentally alter the course of the proceedings. Valencia Nanlanlam Thunua, the daughter who had invited her mother to the house where she would be killed, chose to enter into a plea and sentence agreement with the state. This type of agreement allows a defendant to plead guilty to certain charges in exchange for a predetermined sentence, eliminating the need for a full trial. It also requires the defendant to provide testimony about the crime, offering prosecutors valuable information about what happened and who was involved. On January 29, 2024, Valencia stood before the Mpumalanga Division of the High Court and entered her guilty plea. She acknowledged her role in the murder of her mother, admitting to the conspiracy that had led to Wanter's poisoning, assault, rape, and strangulation. She confessed to the attempted murder charge, which related to the poisoning incident on January 5th. She admitted to defeating the ends of justice through her attempts to cover up the crime and claim the insurance money. In doing so, Valencia became a witness against her co-accused, providing prosecutors with testimony that would be used in their ongoing cases. The judge overseeing Valencia's sentencing was required to determine an appropriate punishment for crimes of extraordinary cruelty and betrayal. The murder of a parent by their own child represents one of the most profound violations of natural law and social order. The fact that the murder had been motivated purely by financial gain, that Wanter had been tortured and violated before being killed, and that her body had been discarded like garbage all weighed heavily in the court's consideration. On January 30th, 2024, the court handed down its sentence. Valencia Nanlanlam Thunua was sentenced to 20 years of direct imprisonment for the murder of her mother, Wanter Jabulal Dlamini. She received an additional 5 years imprisonment for attempted murder, relating to the poisoning, and 3 years for defeating the ends of justice. However, the court ordered that the sentences for attempted murder and defeating the ends of justice would run concurrently with the murder sentence, meaning they would be served at the same time rather than consecutively. The effective sentence was therefore 20 years of direct imprisonment, meaning Valencia would not be eligible for parole or early release. She would serve the full 2 decades behind bars. The court also declared Valencia unfit to possess a firearm in terms of the Firearms Control Act 60 of 2000, a standard provision for individuals convicted of violent crimes. This declaration ensured that even after her eventual release from prison, she would never be legally permitted to own or carry a gun. The National Prosecuting Authority issued a statement welcoming the sentence and emphasizing its commitment to prosecuting cases where family members are killed for insurance benefits. The statement acknowledged that such cases had become disturbingly common in South Africa, with multiple instances of children, spouses, and siblings murdering their relatives to claim insurance payouts. The NPA's message was clear. These crimes would be vigorously prosecuted, and those found guilty would face severe consequences. But Valencia's conviction and sentencing did not conclude the Walter Dlamini case. 3 other accused individuals still face trial: Bethabil Penelope Mthunua, Nambuso Philadelphia Ndwandwa, and Steen Silo Mashaking. Because Valencia had pleaded guilty and separated her case from theirs, the remaining defendants would face trial separately. Their case was postponed multiple times as legal proceedings moved forward. In January 2024, just before Valencia's sentencing, the trial for the other 3 accused was delayed when Bethabil terminated the services of her previous legal representative, and her new attorney requested time to consult with her client in preparation for trial. The trial was rescheduled for November 18th through December 6th, 2024, with a new presiding officer assigned to hear the case. The 3 remaining accused faced the same serious charges that Valencia had pleaded guilty to: murder, conspiracy to commit murder, theft, rape, fraud, and defeating the ends of justice. Each charge carried the potential for substantial prison time if convictions were secured. The prosecution would rely on the evidence gathered during the police investigation, including forensic evidence, witness testimony, and potentially the testimony of Valencia herself, who had agreed to cooperate with authorities as part of her plea agreement. This case have prompted insurance companies to implement more stringent verification procedures and to work more closely with law enforcement when suspicious claims are filed. They have also raised questions about the ease with which fraudulent policies can be taken out in another person's name and about the safeguards that should be in place to prevent such abuses. Beyond the systemic issues, the Walter Dlamini case raises profound questions about human nature, family bonds, and the corrosive power of greed. How does a daughter reach the point where she can participate in the murder of her own mother? What combination of circumstances, personality traits, and moral failures allows someone to value 80,000 rand more than a human life, especially the life of the person who gave birth to them and raised them? These questions have no easy answers, but they lie at the heart of this tragedy. For the community of Barberton and the broader Mpumalanga region, the case served as a shocking reminder that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places. Walter Dlamini was murdered not by a stranger, not by a random criminal, but by people who knew her intimately, who had shared meals with her, who had called her mother and friend. Her death was not the result of a moment of passion or a sudden loss of control. It was a calculated, premeditated act carried out over multiple days by multiple people working in concert toward a single goal: financial gain. The 20-year sentence handed down to Valencia Nonlandla Mthunua represents society's judgment on her actions, but it cannot restore what was lost. Walter Dlamini is gone, her life cut short at 62 years old in circumstances of unimaginable horror. The insurance money that was supposed to be the reward for her murder was never paid out. The fraud was discovered too quickly, the conspirators caught too soon. In the end, they gained nothing and lost everything: their freedom, their reputations, and whatever remnants of humanity they might have once possessed. As the trial of the 3 remaining accused moves forward, the Walter Dlamini case continues to serve as a stark warning about the consequences of placing monetary gain above human life and family loyalty. It stands as a testament to the importance of thorough investigation by both insurance companies and law enforcement. And it remains a profound tragedy, a story of trust betrayed, of maternal love repaid with violence, and of a woman whose final hours were spent in the hands of those who should have protected her, but who chose instead to destroy her for the coldest of reasons: money. Story 3. The house on Paseo Los Gatos sat like thousands of others in the sun-bleached hills of Chula Vista, California. A stucco home with a 2-car garage and a swing set in the backyard where 3 children once laughed on warm afternoons. Inside, a woman named Maya Milite had spent 20 years building a life she believed was solid. Born Maya Tabalanza in the Philippines in 1981, she had immigrated with her family to Hawaii at 13, growing up in Honolulu, graduating from high school there, and later earning a degree from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. It was in those island years that she met a boy named Larry Millett, a transplant from San Diego, who had come to Hawaii after a troubled adolescence, including a juvenile arrest connected to gang violence. Whatever shadows followed him then seemed, for 2 decades, to fade into the background of an ordinary American marriage. They wed, and Larry served 5 years in the United States Navy before the family settled in San Diego. Maya, meanwhile, built her own career, working as a civilian contract specialist, first at the Southwest Regional Maintenance Center and later at the Naval Information Warfare Center. She was, by every account offered by those who loved her, a devoted mother of 3, a woman who filled her children's lives with small rituals and big affection. Friends and family described her as warm, resilient, and deeply committed to her children. But beneath the surface of the house on Paseo Los Gatos, something had begun to fracture. By late 2020, the marriage that had survived 2 decades was buckling under a weight that no one outside the family fully understood at the time. Larry had grown increasingly controlling and paranoid, suspicious that Maya was involved with another man. Whether that suspicion was rooted in truth or in something darker within Larry's own mind, the effect on the household was corrosive. A friend of Maya's would later allege that Larry had physically abused her, and that Maya lived in genuine fear for the safety of her children. Another friend, sensing the danger, quietly offered her a condominium as a hiding place, a place she could flee to if things became unbearable. By December 2020, Maya had made her decision. She was going to leave. She began taking the deliberate, often frightening steps that any woman preparing to divorce a controlling partner must take. Consulting privately, planning quietly, trying to protect her children while unwinding a life built over 20 years. She likely told herself, as so many do, that once the papers were filed, once the process began, the worst would be behind her. She could not have known that the process itself would become the final chapter of her life. January 7, 2021, began like most winter days in Chula Vista, mild and unremarkable. Maya went about her routine, and at some point that day she picked up her phone and called a divorce attorney's office. It was a small act, a phone call lasting perhaps only a few minutes, but it would later become one of the most scrutinized moments in the entire case, because it was the last confirmed activity anyone could trace to Maya Millett's phone. That evening, around 5 o'clock, Maya was seen at the family home. 2 days later, the family had planned a trip to Big Bear to celebrate her daughter's birthday, a small mountain getaway that should have filled the following weekend with cold air and celebration. Instead, sometime after 5 that evening, Maya Millett disappeared from the world. What happened inside that house afterward has been pieced together only through fragments, testimony, and surveillance footage from neighboring homes. At around 8:30 that night, a neighbor's camera recorded 8 loud bangs near the Millett residence, a sound whose true origin has never been publicly explained. Later that same night, around 10 o'clock, another neighbor's camera picked up the voices of the Millett children playing outside in the cold, oblivious to whatever had transpired hours earlier inside their home. It is a detail that lingers uncomfortably in the mind. 3 young children in a dark backyard on a winter night, laughing, while their mother's fate was already being decided somewhere just beyond the walls they played beside. The following day, January 8th, security footage captured Larry backing the family's black Lexus GX 460 into a position where the rear of the vehicle could not be seen by the camera. When Maya's relatives came to check on her that day, Larry told them she had locked herself alone in a room since the previous afternoon. It was a strange, unsettling explanation, but grief and confusion can make people accept strange explanations, at least for a little while. The next morning, when the family returned and insisted that Larry open the door, they found the room empty. There was no sign of Maya anywhere in the house. That day, Maya's sister, Mari-Chris Druelet, made the phone call that no sibling ever wants to make. She reported her sister missing to the Chula Vista Police Department. 2 days later, Larry told a neighbor a different story about the Lexus, that he had driven it to Anza-Borrego Desert State Park, a remote expanse of desert wilderness east of San Diego, and he asked the neighbor to help detail the vehicle, to clean it inside and out. To investigators looking back on that request, it would read almost like a confession disguised as a favor. In the weeks that followed, Chula Vista transformed into a community defined by its search for one missing woman. On January 13th, volunteers combed through Mount San Miguel Park, scanning brush and ravines for any trace of Maya. 10 days later, investigators executed a search warrant at the Milite home, hunting for physical evidence that might explain what had happened to her. Desperate and frightened, Maya's family hired a private investigator, unwilling to wait passively while official channels moved at their own pace. By early February, the Chula Vista Police Department and Maya's family held a public briefing, asking the wider community to join the search. And then came a moment of false hope and quiet horror combined. Skeletal remains were discovered in Orange County, and for a brief, agonizing window, investigators believed they might belong to Maya. That hope collapsed when the remains were determined to be male, and later, more strangely still, were revealed to be nothing more than animal bones. For a family already suspended between grief and disbelief, even the process of ruling out the worst brought no comfort, only more uncertainty. The searches did not stop. Throughout that year, volunteers scoured the Glamis sand dunes in February, the area near Lower Otay Lake in March, National City, and an abandoned golf course in Chula Vista in May. In late July, at a Filipino-American Friendship Day celebration, the community rallied once more, raising awareness in the hope that someone somewhere might come forward with information. By late October, searchers combed the desolate stretches near the Salton Sea and Fish Creek. Notably, in all this time, in all these searches, Larry Milite never once participated. He did not walk the dunes. He did not comb the brush. He stayed apart from the effort to find the wife he claimed to be worried about. National media outlets began to take notice. Her family's attorney, along with her sister and brother-in-law, appeared on Dr. Phil, pleading for information. As the weeks turned into months, investigators' attention narrowed steadily toward Larry Milite. In an interview given in January 2021, only days after Maya vanished, Larry admitted that he and Maya had argued throughout 2020. Then, on February 3rd, everything changed. Larry hired a criminal defense attorney and abruptly stopped cooperating with the police who were searching for his missing wife. To a grieving family already suspicious of him, this single decision felt like a confirmation of fears they had barely allowed themselves to voice aloud. What investigators uncovered next painted an increasingly disturbing picture. In April 2021, reports emerged that Larry had wanted to hire someone to kill the man he suspected Maya was having an affair with. The following month, police seized his remaining firearms under a gun violence restraining order, citing an unsafe environment for his children. By late July 2021, the Chula Vista Police Department formally named Larry a person of interest. Even as the investigation tightened around him, a bitter custody battle unfolded in parallel. In September, with visitation rights for Maya's parents still contested, Larry made accusations against members of Maya's family, seemingly in an effort to justify keeping the children away from them. It was as though two battles were being fought simultaneously, one for the truth of what happened to Maya, and another for the futures of the 3 children she had left behind. On the morning of Tuesday, October 19, 2021, 9 months after Maya vanished, Chula Vista police finally made their move. Larry Milite was arrested and charged with murdering his wife. At a press conference announcing the arrest, San Diego County District Attorney Summer Stephan stood before reporters and acknowledged what many in the community already feared, that despite everything, Maya's body had still not been found. It was, and remains, one of the more remarkable aspects of the case. California law permits a murder charge to be filed even in the absence of a victim's body, and prosecutors were prepared to rely on that principle. The scale of the investigation that led to this moment was staggering. 67 search warrants had been executed, and 87 interviews conducted before Larry's arrest. Chula Vista Police Chief Roxana Kennedy addressed the community directly, saying that Maya was loved by her family and friends and was committed to her children, adding that her disappearance had impacted so many over the past 9 months, including many people who had never even met May. Following the arrest, investigators searched the Milite home once more and found something chilling: a vial containing a chemical compound associated with hemlock, a plant long infamous in history as a lethal poison. 2 days later, on October 21st, prosecutors revealed another strange thread woven through the case: that Larry had been in constant contact with someone described as a spellcaster, reportedly hoping to use some form of ritual or spell to repair his crumbling marriage. At his arraignment on October 21st, Larry pleaded not guilty. He was held without bail, a decision the judge justified in part by citing his past threats against the man he believed Maya had been involved with. The children, meanwhile, were placed in the custody of their paternal grandparents, and Larry was formally prohibited from contacting them, a measure meant to shield the children from further emotional trauma amid an already devastating loss. Even that restriction, though, could not entirely be enforced. Weeks later, a judge ruled that Larry had violated the order by speaking to his children during phone calls he placed to his own parents from jail, over 100 calls in total, during which he spoke with his children for more than 9 hours, at times asking them to read him newspaper articles about his own upcoming trial. As a consequence, his jailhouse communications were restricted to conversations with his attorney alone. The custody dispute would drag on for years, moving between Maya's sister and Larry's parents, through modifications to visitation schedules, court-appointed guardians, and eventually, therapy sessions for the children trying to make sense of a mother who was gone and a father awaiting trial for her murder. In August 2024, more than 3 years after Maya vanished, Marie-Chris Druelet finally won full custody of her sister's 3 children. For a case this consequential, justice moved with agonizing slowness. In mid-2022, Larry's defense attorney petitioned the court, arguing that Larry was not mentally competent to stand trial. He was examined by a psychiatrist, and in September 2022, Judge Cindy Davis ruled that he was in fact competent. Preliminary hearings finally began in January 2023, stretching across more than a week and drawing testimony from over a dozen witnesses, including Maya's sister Marie-Chris, her brother J.R. Tabalanza, her father Pablito Tabalanza, a forensic specialist, and Maya's co-workers and supervisor. On January 25, 2023, Judge Dwayne Mooring ruled that there was enough evidence for Larry to stand trial for murder, alongside a separate charge for illegal possession of an assault weapon. And then came delay after delay. The trial, once expected to begin in 2023, was pushed to July 2025 due to financial hardship claims from Larry's defense. It was delayed again to January 2026, then again to March 2026, described at the time as expected to be the final postponement. Even that promise proved hollow. In January 2026, Larry's attorneys requested yet another delay, and the trial was finally set to begin on May 11, 2026, more than 5 years after Maya vanished from her own home. When jury selection finally concluded, 7 women and 5 men were chosen to decide Larry Milite's fate, with 6 alternates standing ready. The trial opened on May 18, 2026, in a Chula Vista courtroom, with Larry seated in a maroon sweater, staring straight ahead as prosecutors laid out their case. Deputy District Attorney Christy Bowles described the marriage as unhealthy and toxic, telling the jury plainly, rather than let her leave, he killed her. She detailed how, on January 8, 2021, the day after Maya vanished, and the day before the planned Big Bear trip for their daughter's birthday, Maya had reached out to a law firm about the divorce process. Bowles told the jury that Larry had loaded his wife's body into the family SUV, driven to a remote location, and disposed of it there, a plan she described as so well conceived. Her body has never been found. The defense, led by attorney Colby Ryan, pushed back forcefully, arguing that there was no crime scene, no direct physical evidence, and significant gaps throughout the police investigation that should leave jurors with reasonable doubt. As the trial unfolded over the following weeks, testimony grew increasingly dramatic. Jurors heard about an alleged affair, about the mysterious spellcaster Larry had corresponded with, and about apparent references to poison. On the 12th day of trial, in early June, prosecutors read aloud from Maya's own journal entries, private writings in which she expressed deep fear about her husband and accused him of abusive behavior. The lead investigator from the district attorney's office, James Rhodes, who had worked the case since its earliest days in 2021, testified about notes discovered during the search of the family home, and about the exhaustive review of neighborhood surveillance and ring camera footage, which showed no evidence whatsoever of Maya leaving the house after she was last seen returning inside at 4:45 that afternoon. By early July 2026, testimony had concluded. Larry chose not to take the stand in his own defense. Prosecutors and investigators maintained that in the more than 5 years since Maya disappeared, there had been no confirmed sightings of her, no cell phone activity, and no financial transactions linked to her name anywhere. Closing arguments were expected the following week, after which the case would finally pass into the hands of the jury. More than 5 years after Maya Millet last walked through the door of her Chula Vista home, her 3 children have grown up largely without her, raised first by grandparents and then, eventually, by the aunt who never stopped fighting for them. Her parents, Pablito and Noemi Tabalanza, have spent those years testifying, searching, and hoping for a resolution that has always seemed to hover just out of reach. Her body has never been recovered, despite dozens of searches across deserts, lakesides, and abandoned properties throughout San Diego and Imperial counties. Whatever verdict the jury ultimately reaches, it will not undo the years of uncertainty that have defined this case, the birthday trip that never happened, the backyard laughter recorded on a winter night that no one at the time understood was already tinged with tragedy, or the quiet, ordinary phone call to a divorce attorney that would become the last trace of a woman's voice reaching out into the world. Maya Millet's story is, above all, a story about the space between disappearance and answers, and about a family that has spent more than half a decade refusing to let that space swallow her memory whole. Story 4. The music pulsed through the Landing Bar and Grill in Valrico, Florida, on the warm evening of May 27, 2022, as patrons laughed, danced, and tried to shake off the week's stress. Among them was Kay Baker, a 43-year-old third-grade math and science teacher at Cypress Creek Elementary School in Ruskin, beloved by students and colleagues alike for her patience and dedication. She had come to the bar with her boyfriend of several months, Matthew Robertson Terry, a 47-year-old man she had welcomed into her life and her home in the quiet Lithia neighborhood. Kay was the mother of 2 children, and those who knew her described her as vibrant, caring, and devoted to her family and her students. She had worked hard to build a stable life, and in Matthew, she thought she had found companionship. But as the evening wore on at the Landing Bar and Grill, something shifted in the atmosphere between the couple. A darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface of their relationship began to emerge. Kay excused herself to use the restroom, and on her way back to the table, she passed through the crowded bar area where people were dancing. A man, caught up in the music and the festive mood, danced briefly alongside her as she made her way through the crowd. A fleeting, innocent moment that meant nothing to Kay. But Matthew saw it, and what he saw ignited something dangerous inside him, became hostile, his demeanor transforming from relaxed to aggressive in an instant. He began berating Kay, accusing her of dancing with another man, his voice rising above the music as jealousy consumed him. Kay tried to defuse the situation, but Matthew's anger only intensified. The evening that had started with the promise of relaxation had turned toxic, and the couple left the bar shortly before midnight, driving the short distance back to Kay's home on Kite Ridge Drive in Lithia. What Kay didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Matthew Terry had a violent past that she had never been told about in full, a history that made him far more dangerous than she could have imagined. 5 years earlier, in 2017, Matthew had been living in Michigan with another woman named Michelle Rogers. Like Kay, Michelle had trusted Matthew, had believed in the possibility of a future with him. But one evening, after Matthew had been drinking, He turned on her with a ferocity that nearly cost Michelle her life. According to what Michelle would later recount in court, Matthew attacked her without warning, pushing her to the ground and punching her repeatedly in the face and body. The assault was brutal and relentless, and when Matthew temporarily stopped, Michelle's relief was short-lived. Matthew left the room only to return moments later with a kitchen knife. He came up behind Michelle and plunged the blade into her neck. As she screamed and tried to escape, bleeding and terrified, Matthew followed her outside, continuing the assault. He stabbed her 3 more times in the shoulder as she desperately tried to flee down their driveway. Neighbors heard Michelle's screams and called the police, likely saving her life. Michelle managed to wrestle the knife away from Matthew and tucked it beneath her body as she collapsed, using what little strength she had left to prevent him from using it again. When police arrived, they found her covered in blood, barely conscious, but alive. Matthew was arrested and charged with assault with intent to cause great bodily harm. He was convicted and sent to prison in Michigan, but the sentence he received was far shorter than the severity of his crime warranted, and after serving his time, Matthew was released. He made his way to Florida, seeking a fresh start in a new state where nobody knew about his violent past. Just 5 months after his release from prison, he met Kay Baker. Kay had no idea that the man sharing her home, the man she was building a relationship with, had nearly killed another woman in circumstances eerily similar to what would soon unfold. If she had known, if someone had warned her, she might have had a chance to protect herself. But the justice system had let Matthew Terry slip through its cracks, and Kay Baker would pay the ultimate price for that failure. When Kay and Matthew returned to her home on Kite Ridge Drive shortly after midnight on May 28, 2022, Matthew's jealous rage had not subsided. The argument that had started at the bar continued inside the house, Matthew's accusations growing more intense, his behavior more threatening. Kay recognized danger when she saw it. She had to. She was a teacher, trained to notice when something was wrong, when someone was unsafe. As Matthew's anger escalated, Kay made a decision that would haunt investigators when they later reconstructed the scene. She tried to barricade herself in her bedroom. The evidence investigators would find inside Kay's home told a story of desperate terror. The bedroom door showed signs of forced entry, as if someone had broken through it with violent determination. The bathroom door had been kicked in, the wood splintered from the impact. And throughout the house, there was blood, trails of it leading from the interior rooms to the outside, marking the path of what must have been a horrific pursuit. At some point during the attack, Matthew went to the kitchen and removed a single knife from the butcher block on the counter. This knife, which investigators would note was missing from the set, became the weapon that would end Kay Baker's life. Whether Kay was still inside the house when the stabbing began, or whether she had managed to escape outside, the evidence suggested that she fought desperately to survive. Her hands bore defensive wounds, the marks of someone trying to ward off a blade that kept coming at her again and again. Shortly after 12:30 in the morning, neighbors on Kite Ridge Drive were jolted awake by the sound of a thump followed by a woman's voice gasping and crying. The sounds were unmistakable. Someone was in terrible distress. One neighbor, unable to ignore what he was hearing, rushed outside to investigate. What he found between 2 homes would be seared into his memory forever. Kay Baker, lying on the ground, her throat slashed, struggling to breathe, blood pooling around her body. The neighbor immediately called 911, and deputies from the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office rushed to the scene. When they arrived, they found Kay beyond saving. She had been stabbed multiple times in the neck with such force that the knife had severed her carotid artery, her jugular vein, and her voice box. The wounds were so deep and devastating that they had nearly decapitated her. Kay Baker, the devoted mother and beloved teacher who had spent her life nurturing and educating children, died in her neighbor's yard, murdered by the man she had trusted. Deputies quickly assessed the scene and noticed something crucial: a trail of blood leading away from Kay's body, through her yard, and into a wooded area behind her home near Lithia Pinecrest Road. AK 9 unit was called in, and officers followed the trail with their police dog through the darkness. The blood led them to a thicket of overgrown brush and trees, and there, lying face down in the undergrowth, was Matthew Robertson Terry. Matthew was wearing only a blood-soaked t-shirt and underwear. His clothes were drenched in Kay's blood, and he appeared to be intoxicated. When deputies ordered him to show his hands and stand up, body camera footage would later show the dramatic moment of his apprehension. Matthew offered no resistance, no explanation, no remorse. He was immediately arrested and charged with first-degree premeditated murder. As investigators processed the crime scene, the pieces of what had happened became clearer. Kay had been attacked inside her home, had tried to defend herself, and had ultimately fled outside, perhaps hoping that being in view of neighbors would save her. But Matthew had pursued her, and in those final moments, as she gasped and struggled to breathe, her life had slipped away. The knife that killed her was never recovered, though investigators believed Matthew had disposed of it somewhere between Kay's body and the wooded area where he was found. The case against Matthew Terry seemed overwhelming from the start. His clothes were covered in the victim's blood. He had fled the scene. The evidence of forced entry into Kay's bedroom and bathroom suggested a violent struggle. And then there was his past. A nearly identical attack on Michelle Rogers just 5 years earlier. An attack that bore such striking similarities to Kay's murder that it was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. When the case went to trial in November 2022, the prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Justin Diaz, painted a picture of Matthew Terry as a controlling, jealous, violent man who had killed Kay Baker in a drunken rage over his perception that she had flirted with another man. Diaz told the jury about the incident at the bar, about Matthew's hostile reaction to seeing Kay near another dancing patron, about how that jealousy had festered and exploded into lethal violence once they returned home. The prosecution's case was built on physical evidence. Kay's blood on Matthew's clothes, the blood trail leading to where he was found, the missing knife from the kitchen, the defensive wounds on Kay's hands and body, and on the testimony of witnesses who had seen Matthew's behavior that night. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Michelle Rogers, Matthew's ex-girlfriend who had survived his previous attack in Michigan. Michelle took the stand on the Tuesday of the trial, and as she recounted the night Matthew had stabbed her, her voice broke with emotion. She described how he had punched her repeatedly, how he had retrieved a knife and stabbed her in the neck from behind, how he had pursued her outside and stabbed her 3 more times in the shoulder as she begged for her life. She told the jury about lying on the driveway, certain she was going to die and would never see her children again, about wresting the knife away from Matthew and hiding it beneath her body. Her testimony was devastating, not just because of what she had endured, but because it demonstrated a clear pattern of behavior. When Matthew Terry drank and became jealous or angry, he grabbed a knife and stabbed women in the neck. The parallels between Michelle's attack and Kay's murder were impossible to ignore. Both women had been stabbed in the neck with kitchen knives. Both attacks occurred when Matthew was intoxicated. Both involved jealousy or perceived slights, and both demonstrated a level of brutality that suggested Matthew was capable of extreme violence when triggered. The defense attorneys, led by Donna Perry, faced an uphill battle. They attempted to construct an alternative narrative, that Kay had been attacked by an unknown home intruder who had then turned on Matthew when he tried to help her and pursue the assailant. Perry argued that Matthew had Kay's blood on his hands because he had tried to render aid to her after the intruder stabbed her, and that his own blood was mixed with hers because he too had been attacked. She called this unknown assailant a phantom attacker and suggested that Matthew was actually a brave hero who had chased the real killer into the woods. But the prosecution quickly dismantled this theory. There was no evidence of any third person at the scene. No footprints, no DNA, no witnesses who saw anyone fleeing. The blood trail led directly from Kay's body to where Matthew was found, with no indication of anyone else involved. And critically, there were no significant injuries on Matthew that would have been consistent with him being attacked himself. Prosecutor Diaz told the jury, "One person has Kay Baker's blood on his hands both literally and figuratively. Do not believe in the phantom killer. Matthew Terry killed Baker. He ran from the scene. Matthew had initially planned to testify in his own defense, but after consulting with his attorneys, he changed his mind. The decision not to take the stand would later become a source of controversy, with Matthew claiming after his conviction that his lawyers had made promises to him in exchange for not testifying, though he would not specify what those promises were. The judge would later deny his motion for a new trial based on these claims. The jury heard closing arguments on November 14, 2022, and retired to deliberate around 3 o'clock that afternoon. It took them only slightly more than an hour. Some reports said just over an hour, others said a few hours, to reach their verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, Matthew Terry stood with his chin held high, showing little reaction as the verdict was read: guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. But the trial was not over. Because the prosecution, under interim state attorney Susan Lopez, had sought the death penalty, the case moved into a penalty phase. Lopez had filed notice that her office would seek capital punishment for what she called Matthew's despicable murder of Kay Baker, citing the especially heinous, cruel, and atrocious nature of the crime and Matthew's history of violent behavior. She had stated, "Defendant Matthew Terry's actions were especially heinous, cruel, and atrocious. He was merciless in his brutal killing of Ms. Baker, and given his history of violent behavior, we will ask a jury to sentence him to death." The penalty phase began the day after the guilty verdict, on November 16, 2022, with prosecutors urging the jury to recommend a death sentence. They argued that Matthew's prior conviction for violently attacking Michelle Rogers was an aggravating factor, that his attack on Kay had been particularly cruel, and that he showed no remorse for his actions. The defense, meanwhile, asked the jury for mercy, though the specifics of their mitigation arguments were less extensively reported. On November 17, 2022, the jury returned with their sentencing recommendation: life in prison without the possibility of parole. While they had found Matthew guilty of first-degree murder, they did not believe the aggravating factors outweighed the mitigating circumstances sufficiently to warrant a death sentence. Judge Christopher Sabella accepted the jury's recommendation and sentenced Matthew Terry to life without parole that same day. In pronouncing sentence, the judge acknowledged the devastating impact of Matthew's actions. Kay Baker was a beloved teacher, a mother of two, a woman who had dedicated her life to helping children learn and grow. Her students had lost a mentor. Her children had lost their mother. And all of it had been taken away in a fit of drunken, jealous rage by a man who should never have been free to hurt anyone again after what he did to Michelle Rogers. Michelle Rogers, watching the verdict and sentencing unfold, later reflected on the bittersweet nature of justice. She told reporters, "The verdict in his trial and the sentencing gives you a lot of feelings, especially since someone had to die for the truth to be known, and that's heartbreaking." She had survived Matthew Terry's violence, had lived to tell her story and help convict him, but Kay Baker had not been so fortunate. If the Michigan justice system had given Matthew a longer sentence, if someone had warned Kay about his past, she might still be alive. Matthew Terry is currently incarcerated at Hardy Correctional Institution in Florida, serving his life sentence without the possibility of parole. He has filed appeals challenging his conviction, claiming that his attorneys misled him and that he deserves a new trial, but as of the latest reports, all of his motions have been denied. Judge Sabella ruled that any claims about promises made by his attorneys would need to wait until all of Matthew's appeals were exhausted. In the end, justice was served in the legal sense. Matthew Terry will spend the rest of his life in prison, never again free to harm another woman. But for Kay Baker's family, for her children, and for the students who will never again sit in her classroom, no verdict can undo the loss, no sentence can bring back what was taken. The only solace is that Matthew Terry's days of violence are over, and that Michelle Rogers lived to ensure that the truth about who he really was could not be hidden or denied. Story 5. The tattoo on Brooke Deviney's body carried a message that seemed both prophetic and tragic in retrospect. Everybody dies, but not everybody lives. At 19 years old, Brooke was determined to live fully, to embrace the promise of motherhood that had recently revealed itself in the form of a 14-week pregnancy, and to build a future for herself and the baby boy she planned to name Aiden. She was excited about the pregnancy, sharing the news with family and friends, making plans for the life growing inside her. But the man who had fathered that child, 23-year-old Devin Blair, saw Brooke's pregnancy not as a blessing, but as a complication in a relationship defined by violence, control, and escalating rage. Brooke lived with her family in a home on Parkwick Drive in Columbus, Ohio, in a neighborhood that backed up to a park with a police station situated in the middle of it. The proximity to law enforcement should have provided some measure of safety, some reassurance that help was always nearby if danger emerged. But as Brooke would learn through heartbreaking experience, being close to a police station meant nothing when the system designed to protect domestic violence victims failed at nearly every critical juncture. Brooke and Devin had been in an on-and-off relationship, the kind of tumultuous connection marked by passionate reconciliations and explosive conflicts that left Brooke injured and terrified. Friends and family who knew Brooke described her as someone worth celebrating, a young woman whose life had value and whose future should have stretched before her with infinite possibility. But that future was being systematically destroyed by a man who saw violence as an acceptable response to any situation that didn't go his way. The first documented incident that would set the stage for Brooke's murder occurred in December 2023, when Devin Blair subjected her to an assault so brutal and degrading that it should have resulted in him being permanently separated from her. During that attack, Blair forced Brooke to strip naked in the driveway of a home, an act of humiliation designed to strip away her dignity along with her clothing. He then dragged her by the hair, his fists connecting with her body repeatedly as she tried to defend herself. At some point during the assault, Blair pulled out a knife, holding the blade to Brooke's throat while making a promise that would prove chillingly accurate months later. "I'll kill you." The threats didn't stop with the knife at her throat. Blair also told Brooke he would bash in her head, describing in graphic detail the violence he intended to inflict on her if she didn't comply with his demands. The assault left Brooke traumatized and injured, but she found the courage to report what had happened to police, initiating a criminal case against the man who had terrorized her. On March 29, 2024, just a few months after the December assault, Devin Blair attacked Brooke again. This assault was severe enough to cause a traumatic brain injury and a laceration on her scalp. Brooke sustained abrasions on her face and neck, and Blair even bit her arm hard enough to leave a mark that would still be visible months later during her autopsy. The pattern was clear and escalating. Each attack became more violent, more dangerous, more likely to result in permanent injury or death. Despite the severity of these assaults, the criminal justice system moved with bureaucratic slowness. It wasn't until May 16, 2024, 5 months after the December assault and nearly 2 months after the March attack, that Devin Blair finally appeared in court to enter a plea. He pleaded guilty to felony domestic violence and assault charges, admitting to at least some of what he had done to Brooke. The guilty plea should have resulted in immediate incarceration, should have put Blair behind bars where he could no longer harm Brooke or anyone else. Instead, Franklin County Common Pleas Court Judge Michael Holbrook made a decision that would have fatal consequences. The judge ordered a pre-sentencing evaluation and released Blair from jail with electronic monitoring via an ankle bracelet. Standing in the courtroom, Judge Holbrook expressed hope that Devin would comply with the terms of his release, telling the defendant directly, "I'm taking a chance. Don't disappoint me." The judge ordered Blair to stay away from Brooke, to wear the ankle monitor at all times, and to await his sentencing hearing while remaining under supervision. But within days of being fitted with the electronic monitor, Blair claimed the device had come off during a car crash. Whether the crash was genuine or fabricated as an excuse to remove the monitoring device, the result was the same. Blair was now free to move without any electronic tracking, able to violate the no-contact order without authorities being immediately alerted. An arrest warrant was issued for violating the terms of his release, but it remained unserved as days passed, and Blair continued to move freely through Columbus. On June 12, 2024, just 4 days before Brooke's murder, she went to police yet again to report that Devin had attacked her. During an argument in her car, Blair had punched Brooke in the face, his fist connecting with her eye. As she tried to drive away, seeking the safety of her parents' house, Devin warned her not to take the freeway exit that would lead her to them. The threat was implicit but clear. If she tried to seek help from her family, there would be consequences. Brooke was terrified, and she had every reason to be. At some point in the days leading up to June 16th, she confided in her mother, Billy Deviney, about her fear. Brooke told her mother that she had filed a police report and a protection order against Devin. "Mom, once he finds out what I did, he's going to kill me," Brooke said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine terror. Her words were not teenage dramatics or exaggeration. They were a prediction based on months of escalating violence and explicit death threats. The morning of June 16th, 2024, dawned like any other Sunday in Columbus, but inside the Deviney family home on Parkwick Drive, tension had been building for hours. Devin Blair had arrived at the house, violating the no-contact order that should have kept him away from Brooke. He went into Brooke's bedroom, and the two began to argue. Brooke's brother and sister-in-law, who were also in the home, could hear the fight escalating, the voices rising as the dispute intensified. For approximately an hour, the argument raged behind Brooke's closed bedroom door. Her brother and sister-in-law grew increasingly alarmed as they heard the sounds of what appeared to be a physical altercation. Screams pierced through the walls, the unmistakable sounds of violence unfolding just feet away from where they stood. And then suddenly there was silence, a terrible, ominous quiet that was somehow more frightening than the screams had been. At 7:28 on Sunday morning, Brooke's sister-in-law sent a text message to 911, reporting that Devin Blair was assaulting Brooke inside the Parkwick Drive home. The text dispatch was answered immediately, with Columbus police officers being dispatched to the residence. But by the time help had been summoned, irreparable damage had already been done. After the fight fell silent, Brooke's family members saw Devin Blair pacing throughout the house, his demeanor agitated as he moved from room to room. Then he walked through the garage and left the property. When police officers arrived at the Parkwick Drive home just minutes later, they found Blair standing near the driver's door of Brooke's vehicle, holding a backpack and wearing no shoes. Officers immediately recognized Blair as someone who had an active arrest warrant, and as they approached to take him into custody, Blair made a split-second decision. He ran. Body camera footage captured by responding officers shows Blair jumping a fence and fleeing through the neighborhood that backed up to the park where the police station was located. For the next several hours, Columbus police conducted a manhunt, searching the area for the suspect they knew was responsible for whatever had happened inside the Deviney home. While officers pursued Blair through the neighborhood, other first responders entered Brooke's bedroom. What they found there was a scene of unspeakable horror. Brooke was lying on her bed, her body curled into a fetal position and wrapped in sheets. She was unresponsive, her breathing absent, her skin already taking on the pallor that indicated life was slipping away. Officers immediately began performing CPR and other life-saving measures, while calling for Franklin Township fire medics to transport her to a hospital. Brooke Deviney was rushed to a local medical facility in critical condition, suffering from what was initially described as blunt force trauma injuries. Doctors and nurses worked frantically to save both Brooke and her unborn baby, but the damage was too severe. At 8:45 on the morning of June 16, 2024, Brooke was pronounced dead. Her unborn son, the baby boy she had planned to name Aiden, died with her, never having had the chance to take a single breath. The Franklin County Coroner's Office conducted an autopsy to determine the exact cause of death. The findings, released in late July 2024, revealed that Brooke had died from asphyxia caused by neck compression and blunt trauma to the head. Detective James Jude, testifying during a court hearing, described the injuries as cervical compression injuries commonly seen in strangulation cases. The autopsy also documented all the previous injuries Brooke had sustained. The traumatic brain injury from the March assault, the scalp laceration, the abrasions on her face and neck, and the bite mark on her arm. Her body was a roadmap of violence, a chronicle of the months of abuse she had endured at Devin Blair's hands. Approximately 5 hours after he had fled from police, Devin Blair was finally apprehended outside a vacant home. When officers took him into custody, they noted that Blair had scratches on his body and blood-stained clothing, physical evidence that he had been involved in a violent struggle. During his arrest, Blair's violent nature manifested again. He punched and bit one of the arresting officers in the head, adding assault on a police officer to his growing list of charges. Devin Blair was initially charged with murder in the deaths of both Brooke and her unborn child. On June 18, 2024, just 2 days after Brooke's murder, Blair appeared via video at his arraignment in Franklin County Municipal Court. What should have been a solemn proceeding marked by the gravity of the charges became a spectacle as Blair yelled obscenities at the judge, speaking over both the prosecutor and his public defender, his anger and lack of remorse on full display. Judge Holbrook, the same judge who had released Blair on bond with the hopeful admonition not to disappoint him, set Blair's bond at $11 million, an astronomical amount that reflected the severity of the crimes and the danger Blair posed. On July 9, 2024, during another court appearance, prosecutors formally requested that Blair be held without bond. They argued that his extensive criminal history, his pattern of domestic violence, his active arrest warrant at the time of the murder, and the brutal nature of Brooke's death all justified denying him any possibility of release. Judge Holbrook granted the request, ordering Blair held without bond as his case proceeded through the criminal justice system. For more than a year, Devin Blair remained incarcerated in the Franklin County Jail while his attorneys and prosecutors worked toward a resolution. Friends and family of Brooke Deviney gathered at Columbus Prep Academy to celebrate her life, sharing memories of a young woman whose warmth and spirit had touched everyone who knew her. They mourned not just the loss of Brooke, but also the loss of Aiden, the baby who would never get to experience his mother's love or the life she had been planning for him. On July 20th, 2025, more than a year after Brooke's murder, Devin Blair appeared in Franklin County Common Pleas Court to enter a plea. In exchange for avoiding a trial, Blair pleaded guilty to 1 count of strangulation and 2 counts each of involuntary manslaughter and felonious assault. The plea deal meant that Blair would not face a first-degree murder charge, which could have resulted in a life sentence, but it guaranteed that he would spend decades behind bars. The sentencing hearing was an emotional proceeding that brought Brooke's family face to face with the man who had destroyed their lives. Billie Deviney, Brooke's mother, delivered a victim impact statement that left no doubt about the devastation Blair had caused. She recounted how Brooke had come to her in fear, how she had warned that Blair was going to kill her, and how that prediction had come true despite all of Brooke's attempts to seek protection. She filed a police report and a protection order, Billie told the court, her voice breaking. She said, "Mom, once he finds out what I did, he's going to kill me, Mom." And then he did. Devin Blair also spoke during the sentencing hearing, beginning with an apology to Brooke's family. But whatever words of remorse he offered could never undo the violence he had inflicted or restore the 2 lives he had taken. Judge Holbrook, the same judge who had given Blair a chance by releasing him on bond with electronic monitoring months earlier, now faced the task of sentencing the man who had betrayed that trust in the most horrific way possible. The sentence handed down was severe. Blair received between 46 and 51.5 years in prison for the strangulation and manslaughter charges. Additionally, he received a consecutive 2-year sentence for the previous domestic violence assault and the assault on the Franklin County Sheriff's deputies during his arrest. The total sentence meant that Devin Blair, now 24 years old, would spend at least 48 years behind bars, likely dying in prison long before becoming eligible for parole. As part of the plea agreement, Blair agreed to make no applications for early release, ensuring that he would serve every day of the minimum sentence. The case of Brooke Deviney exposed systemic failures at every level of the criminal justice system's response to domestic violence. Despite multiple police reports, despite a guilty plea to felony domestic violence, despite an active arrest warrant for violating bond conditions, Devin Blair remained free to continue terrorizing Brooke. The electronic monitoring device that was supposed to track his movements was removed within days and never replaced. The no-contact order that was supposed to protect Brooke was violated repeatedly, with no immediate consequence. And the protection order Brooke filed in her final days proved to be nothing more than a piece of paper that Blair ignored with impunity. Brooke Devini was 19 years old when she died, 14 weeks pregnant with a baby boy she was excited to welcome into the world. She had reported her abuser to police multiple times, had participated in the criminal justice process by testifying and filing reports, and had begged for protection. She had done everything a victim of domestic violence is told to do, and yet the system failed her at every turn. Her final words to her mother, "He's going to kill me," were not a cry for attention but a statement of fact, a prediction born from intimate knowledge of the man who had been hurting her for months. The tattoo Brooke wore on her body, "Everybody dies but not everybody lives," takes on heartbreaking significance in light of her murder. Brooke wanted to live, to embrace motherhood, to build a future for herself and Aiden. But Devin Blair, through his pattern of escalating violence and his final act of strangulation, robbed her of that chance. He took not just Brooke's life, but also Aiden's, killing 2 people in a bedroom on a Sunday morning, while Brooke's family listened helplessly from elsewhere in the house. As Devin Blair sits in his prison cell serving his minimum 48-year sentence, Brooke's family continues to grieve the daughter, sister, and mother-to-be they lost. The neighborhood on Parkwick Drive, where a police station sits in the middle of a park just yards from where Brooke died, stands as a painful reminder that proximity to law enforcement means nothing if the system doesn't act decisively to protect victims. And Brooke's story joins the tragic chorus of women killed by intimate partners despite seeking help, despite following procedures, despite doing everything they could to survive. The case is a testament to the urgent need for reform in how the criminal justice system handles domestic violence cases, particularly when it comes to bond decisions, electronic monitoring, and enforcement of protection orders. Brooke Devini deserved to live, to become a mother, to watch her son Aiden grow. Instead, she became another statistic, another name on the growing list of domestic violence victims failed by a system that should have protected them. Her memory demands that we do better, that we listen when women say they're in danger, and that we act before it's too late. Story 6. The winter evening of December 11th, 1974, settled cold and dark over the small German town of Ursbach, a quiet community where families knew one another and crime was something that happened elsewhere, in distant cities with unfamiliar names. 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer had her whole life stretching before her like an unwritten story, full of possibilities she had yet to discover. She was young, vibrant, and trusting in the way that people who have never encountered true evil often are. That night, as she made her way to visit a friend, she had no way of knowing that she was walking directly into the path of a man who would not only end her life, but would become one of the most notorious serial killers in Austrian criminal history. Jack Unterweger was born Johann Unterweger on August 16, 1950, in Austria, and from the very beginning, his life was marked by abandonment and instability. His mother, a young woman who worked in the oldest profession, had given birth to him and then left him behind, unable or unwilling to raise the child she had brought into the world. Jack grew up without her, passed between relatives, never quite belonging anywhere, never quite feeling loved. This abandonment carved something dark and hollow inside him, a wound that never healed and that would, in time, fester into something monstrous. As he grew into adolescence and then early adulthood, Unterweger began to act out his rage and pain through violence, particularly violence directed at women. By his early 20s, he had already compiled a disturbing record of assaults and attacks. On May 13, 1971, in Salzburg, Unterweger picked up a woman who worked as a companion for hire, a woman known as Monica H. He drove her out to the moors outside the city, a desolate landscape where screams would go unheard and witnesses did not exist. Inside his vehicle, Unterweger struck Monica in the back of her head with a metal rod, stripped her clothing from her body, bound her with her own undergarments, and subjected her to a brutal assault while he gratified himself. She survived, though the psychological wounds would linger far longer than the physical ones. In October 1973, Unterweger picked up a nurse named Maria W., who was hitchhiking near Kitzbühel. He drove her to Oberndorf under the pretense of running an errand, and when they headed back toward the main road, he suddenly stopped the car and began punching her while attempting to force himself upon her. She too survived, traumatized but alive. By 1974, Unterweger was in a relationship with a woman named Barbara Scholz, and it was a partnership steeped in dysfunction and criminality. Shortly after being convicted of theft in March of that year, Unterweger entered into a brief but violent relationship with another woman, Elizabeth L., in Rohrbach. He beat her, violated her, and terrorized her by threatening to kidnap her child and mutilate the child's face with razor blades if she spoke of what he had done. In July, he physically assaulted 2 more women, one of whom lost a tooth from the violence of his attack. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who looked closely. Jack Unterweger was escalating, his violence growing more brazen, more frequent, more dangerous. That December evening, Unterweger and Barbara Scholz drove to Ursbach to burglarize the home of Scholz's parents. They had broken into the house and were in the midst of stealing when Margaret Schaefer, a friend of Barbara's, unexpectedly arrived and caught them in the act. Margaret stood there, shocked and confused, trying to make sense of what she was witnessing. Barbara and Jack quickly talked to her, their voices smooth and reassuring, convincing Margaret to keep quiet about what she had seen. They asked her to come with them in the car, promising they would explain everything, that it was all a misunderstanding, that no harm would come to her if she just got in and heard them out. Trusting people she thought she knew, Margaret agreed. The car drove away from Ursbach, away from the safety of streetlights and houses, away from anyone who might help. As they traveled into the darkness, the atmosphere inside the vehicle shifted. Jack Unterweger's demeanor changed, the mask of civility falling away to reveal the predator beneath. Without warning, he struck Margaret hard in the face, the impact shocking and disorienting. Before she could react or defend herself, he seized her hands and bound them behind her back with brutal efficiency. The car continued deeper into the woods, the headlights cutting through the blackness like searching eyes, until finally Unterweger stopped in a remote, forested area where no one would hear what was about to happen. He forced Margaret out of the car and marched her into the trees, his girlfriend Barbara remaining behind. For 10 minutes, Margaret Schaefer endured unimaginable terror and pain in those dark woods. Unterweger beat her repeatedly with an iron bar, the metal striking flesh and bone with sickening force. He bound her further with her own pantyhose, rendering her helpless. Then he violated her with the weapon, subjecting her to degradation and agony beyond description. Finally, with his hands wrapped around her throat, Jack Unterweger manually strangled the life out of 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer. When Unterweger returned to the car 10 minutes later, he came back alone, carrying a steel whip covered in blood and strands of hair. He had left Margaret's body in the woods, covering it with dirt and leaves, and in a calculated attempt to mislead investigators, he had tied her bra around her neck after death to make it appear as though the killing had been purely sexually motivated, obscuring the robbery and premeditation that had preceded it. The investigation that followed eventually led police to Jack Unterweger and Barbara Scholz. Germany allowed Austria to handle the prosecution, and on June 1, 1976, Unterweger stood trial for the murder of Margaret Schaefer. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment, while Barbara Scholz received 8 years as an accomplice. At his trial, Unterweger offered a defense that would become a recurring theme in his manipulation of public perception. He claimed that he had killed Schaefer while experiencing a drug-induced blackout during which he hallucinated that she was his mother, the woman who had abandoned him as a child. He conveniently omitted the robbery, the binding, the rape, presenting himself as a victim of his own traumatic past rather than as a cold, calculating predator. He told the court that his criminal behavior was entirely the result of his terrible childhood, as though abandonment excused brutality and murder justified rage. Behind the walls of Austrian prisons, something extraordinary and disturbing began to happen. Jack Unterweger, the convicted killer, discovered that he possessed a talent for writing. He began to craft stories, poetry, plays, and eventually an autobiographical novel that detailed his difficult upbringing and path to criminality. His writing was compelling, lyrical, and deeply affecting to those who read it. He wrote children's stories that were broadcast on Austrian radio, composed volumes of poetry that critics praised, and produced works that garnered him subsidies from the culture ministry. Intellectuals, artists, and members of Vienna's cultural elite began to champion Unterweger as a symbol of redemption, proof that even the most lost souls could be rehabilitated through education and artistic expression. Nobel laureate Elfriede Jelinek and other prominent figures advocated for his release, convinced that he had transformed himself into a new man, that the killer was gone and only the artist remained. In 1990, after serving just 15 years of his life sentence, Jack Unterweger was released from prison. He stepped out into a world that welcomed him as a celebrity, a reformed criminal who had found salvation through literature. He became a journalist and radio personality, hosting programs and writing articles for respected publications. He attended glamorous parties with Vienna's elite, moved in circles of wealth and influence, and was regarded as living proof that the justice system's focus on rehabilitation could succeed. But the intellectuals and artists who had championed his release had made a catastrophic error in judgment. They had believed his carefully constructed narrative, his performance of redemption, without understanding that some people are fundamentally incapable of change, that some darkness runs too deep to ever be illuminated. Between October 1990 and May 1991, women began to disappear in Austria. They were companions for hire, vulnerable women working on the streets of Vienna and other cities, the kind of women whose absences might not be immediately noticed or investigated with urgency. 7 women vanished during those months, driven to locations outside of town, beaten, violated, and left in forested areas. All of them were manually strangled, some with the killer's hands, others with their own undergarments, bras, pantyhose, stockings, used as ligatures. The killer tied the garments in a distinctive knot, a signature that would eventually link the crimes across international borders. In the summer of 1991, Unterweger received an assignment from the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation to travel to Los Angeles and write a comparative piece about the darker sides of Vienna and the City of Angels. He flew to California and checked into the Cecil Hotel, a downtown establishment that had, years earlier, housed another serial killer named Richard Ramirez. While in Los Angeles, Unterweger went on ride-alongs with LAPD officers, interviewed people working the streets about the dangers they faced, and presented himself as a journalist fascinated by the intersection of crime and society. But he was not merely observing. He was hunting. Shannon Exley, 35 years old, was found deceased on June 20th, 1991. She had been strangled. Irina Rodriguez, 33, was discovered soon after, also strangled. Then came Sherian Long, who also used the name Peggy Jean Booth, age 26. She too had been strangled, and like the victims in Austria, all 3 women had been killed with their own undergarments, tied in the same distinctive knot. Los Angeles police had no reason to suspect a connection to murders thousands of miles away in Vienna. They did not know that the friendly Austrian journalist who had ridden in their patrol cars and asked thoughtful questions about their work was the very predator they were trying to find. Back in Vienna, investigators were beginning to connect the dots. Police counselor Max Edelbacher questioned Unterweger twice during the autumn of 1991. The celebrated writer maintained his innocence, insisting that he valued his freedom and newfound celebrity far too much to jeopardize it with criminal activity. Many of his influential supporters agreed, refusing to believe that the man they had championed could be responsible for such horrors. Some Austrians would continue to believe in Unterweger's innocence even after his conviction, convinced that he was the victim of a police conspiracy or class-based persecution. But evidence was mounting. Police found maps of Los Angeles in Unterweger's apartment, along with business cards from LAPD officers who had taken him on ride-alongs. When they examined the crime scenes more closely, they noticed the distinctive knot pattern, the same method used in Vienna, Prague, and now Los Angeles. DNA evidence began to connect Unterweger to the crimes, including a single blonde hair belonging to a murdered woman from Prague that was found in the BMW Unterweger had abandoned in Paris. In early 1992, tipped off by journalists that authorities were closing in, Jack Unterweger fled Austria with his teenage fiancée, heading to Miami, Florida. But there was no escape. He was apprehended in Miami in February 1992 and extradited back to Austria to face trial. Los Angeles prosecutors had hoped to try him for the 3 California murders, but DNA processing was slow at the time, and Austria moved first. This was significant because California had the death penalty, while Austria did not. The trial was held not in Vienna, whose authorities some felt lacked the courage to prosecute their infamous adopted son, but in the provincial city of Graz. The proceedings revealed the full scope of Unterweger's deceptions and crimes. Psychiatric evaluation diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder. On June 20, 1994, psychiatrist Dr. Reinhard Haller presented his findings to the court. The jury, by a 6-2 majority, sufficient for conviction under Austrian law, found Unterweger guilty of 9 murders, including the 3 in Los Angeles. On June 29, 1994, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jack Unterweger did not spend even one night serving that sentence. That same day, alone in his cell, he fashioned a noose from the drawstring of his tracksuit pants, using the same knot he had used to strangle his victims, and hanged himself. He was 43 years old. In death, as in life, he controlled his own narrative, choosing what he called his final freedom, over facing the consequences of his actions. He left behind at least 12 confirmed victims across 4 countries, though investigators suspected there may have been more. The case of Jack Unterweger stands as a chilling reminder that charisma, intelligence, and artistic talent do not preclude evil, that redemption narratives can be carefully crafted performances, and that some individuals are capable of deceiving even the most educated and well-intentioned observers. Margaret Schaefer, the 18-year-old woman who died in the woods outside Ursbach in 1974, was Unterweger's first confirmed murder victim, but she would not be his last. Her death should have been the end of his capacity to harm others, but instead, misplaced faith in rehabilitation and the seductive power of his written words gave him the opportunity to kill again and again. The women who died in Vienna, Los Angeles, and Prague paid with their lives for society's failure to recognize that beneath the polished veneer of the reformed writer lurked the same predator who had strangled Margaret Schaefer with her own bra in the darkness of a German forest 20 years earlier. Story 7. The frigid December wind swept across the parking lot of the Chevron gas station on Jefferson Davis Highway in Woodbridge, Virginia, carrying with it the promise of an approaching holiday season. Inside the small station, a 50-year-old woman worked the late shift on December 19, 1987, tending to the occasional customer who stopped for gas or cigarettes on that cold Saturday night. She had taken this job to supplement her income, to help make ends meet in a time when single-income households struggled to maintain stability. The work was often lonely, particularly during the evening hours when traffic along the highway thinned and the darkness pressed against the fluorescent-lit windows of the station. She could not have known, as she went about her ordinary duties that night, that the next few minutes would alter the course of her life forever. The restroom facilities at this particular gas station were not located inside the building, but rather in a separate structure outside, a detail that would prove catastrophic. When nature called during her shift, the woman had no choice but to leave the relative safety of the well-lit store and venture into the darkness outside. She walked across the pavement, her breath visible in the cold air, and entered the outdoor bathroom. The door closed behind her, and for a moment she was alone in the small, enclosed space, unaware that she was being watched. What happened next would haunt her for nearly 4 decades. A white male entered the bathroom, moving quickly and with terrible purpose. In his hand, he held a knife, the blade catching what little light penetrated the space. The woman's scream, if she managed one, went unheard in the isolated location. The attacker moved with efficiency, using tape to bind her head and hands, rendering her helpless. He did not know her, had no connection to her life or history. This was a crime of opportunity, a predator spotting vulnerability and striking without hesitation or mercy. The assault that followed was brutal and dehumanizing, leaving the woman traumatized in ways that would never fully heal. When it was over, the attacker vanished into the night, leaving behind a victim whose life had been irrevocably shattered. Police were called to the scene, and investigators did what they could with the tools available in 1987. Evidence was collected from the crime scene, and the following day, the victim underwent the difficult process of a physical evidence recovery kit examination at the hospital, providing samples that investigators hoped would one day identify her attacker. The evidence was processed, and a male DNA profile was developed from the samples. It was a complete profile, clear and usable, but when run through the existing databases, it matched no one. Without a suspect and with no additional leads to follow, the case slowly went cold. Years turned into decades. The woman tried to rebuild her life, carrying the weight of that December night with her through every day that followed. The fear never truly left her, the sense of violation a constant companion. She wondered if the man who had destroyed her sense of safety would ever be found, if justice would ever arrive, or if she would have to live the rest of her life knowing that somewhere out there, her attacker walked free. The investigation file gathered dust and storage, one among thousands of unsolved cases, a testament to the limitations of technology and the cruel reality that not all crimes are solved. But in 2019, more than 3 decades after that terrible night, something changed. 2 detectives with the Prince William County Police Department, Johnina Pinedo and Colleen Grantham, turned their attention to the cold case. Both women specialized in violent crimes and sexual assault investigations, and they understood the importance of giving victims closure even decades after their trauma. The world of forensic science had transformed dramatically since 1987, opening possibilities that previous investigators could never have imagined. Detectives Pinedo and Grantham believed that modern technology might finally provide answers where traditional methods had failed. They retrieved the evidence from storage and sent it to Marshall University Forensic Science Center in West Virginia for genetic genealogy analysis. This relatively new investigative technique had already proven successful in cracking other cold cases across the country. By analyzing DNA and comparing it to publicly available genealogical databases, investigators could build family trees and narrow down potential suspects even when the perpetrator's DNA was not in any criminal database. For months, genealogists worked with the DNA profile developed from the victim's underwear, tracing lineages and connections through generations. The results, when they finally came back, were both promising and perplexing. The analysis had identified 2 brothers as persons of interest, Russell Anthony Marubio and John Arthur Marubio, both residing in Florida, but originally from Minnesota. The genetic markers pointed clearly to this family line, narrowing down decades of uncertainty to 2 specific individuals. There was just one problem, one that threatened to derail the entire investigation despite the breakthrough. Russell and John Marubio were identical twins. Identical twins present a unique challenge in forensic science. They share virtually the same DNA, their genetic codes so similar that traditional DNA testing cannot distinguish between them. For decades, this scientific reality had meant that in cases where identical twins were suspects, prosecutors often could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt which brother had committed the crime, leading to situations where both might go free rather than risk convicting the wrong person. When detectives learned that their genetic genealogy had led them to twins, the initial excitement of the breakthrough dimmed with the realization of the obstacle ahead. Working with Florida authorities, Detectives Pinedo and Grantham obtained buccal swabs from both Russell and John Marubio. The samples were sent for testing, and the results confirmed what the investigators already knew. Both brothers' DNA matched the profile developed from the 1987 crime scene evidence. Traditional DNA analysis could not differentiate between them, but the detectives refused to accept that the case would end here, not after coming so far, not when the victim had waited so long for answers. They reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a company at the forefront of forensic genetic analysis. Scientists at Parabon had been developing a revolutionary technique that they believed could solve the identical twin problem. The method relied on deep whole genome sequencing, a process far more detailed and comprehensive than traditional DNA testing. Every person's genome contains unique mutations called somatic mutations, tiny changes in the DNA that occur after conception and are different even in identical twins. These mutations are rare and difficult to detect, but with advanced sequencing technology and specialized bioinformatics analysis, it was theoretically possible to identify them. The scientists at Parabon, working alongside genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, embarked on an intensive analysis of the DNA samples from both brothers and the crime scene evidence. They sequenced the entire genome multiple times, searching for those elusive somatic mutations that would exist in one twin but not the other. It was painstaking work, requiring patience and precision, as they compared billions of base pairs looking for the tiny differences that would prove decisive. Months of work culminated in a breakthrough. They had identified specific somatic mutations in Russell Marubio's DNA that did not appear in his brother John's DNA. When they compared these unique mutations to the DNA recovered from the crime scene 35 years earlier, they found a match. The analysis conclusively identified Russell Marubio as the twin whose DNA was present at the crime scene. For the first time in United States legal history, scientists had successfully distinguished between identical twins using DNA evidence. The implications were enormous, not just for this case, but for countless others where identical twins had been involved. But the scientific breakthrough was only the beginning. Now prosecutors would have to convince a court to admit this novel evidence and persuade a jury of its validity. On June 23, 2023, Russell Marubio, then 53 years old, was arrested at his home in Putnam County, Florida. The charges were abduction and rape, crimes that had occurred more than 3 decades earlier when he was a young man. Despite objections from prosecutors, a substitute judge named Dennis Smith released Marubio on bond, allowing him to remain free while awaiting trial. Commonwealth's attorney Amy Ashworth's office strongly opposed the bond, arguing that Marubio posed a danger and a flight risk, but their objections were overruled. For nearly 2 years, Russell Marubio lived with the knowledge of the coming trial, the evidence mounting against him, and the revolutionary science that had finally, after so long, pointed directly at him. The trial began in August of 2025 in Prince William County, Virginia, presided over by the Honorable Judge Kimberly A. Irving. The prosecution, led by Commonwealth's attorney Amy Ashworth, faced the challenge of presenting highly technical scientific evidence to a jury of ordinary citizens who would need to understand the validity and reliability of a forensic technique never before used in an American courtroom. The defense would undoubtedly argue that the science was too new, too untested, too unreliable to base a conviction upon. The stakes could not have been higher. If successful, this case would set a legal precedent that would reshape forensic science. If unsuccessful, a revolutionary technique would be discredited and a predator might go free. Expert witnesses took the stand to explain the intricacies of whole genome sequencing, somatic mutations, and the methodology used by Parabon Nanolabs. They walked the jury through the process, demonstrating how the mutations in Russell Marubio's DNA matched those found in the evidence from the crime scene, while his brother John's DNA did not contain these specific markers. The scientists had to make complex genetic concepts accessible to help 12 people understand why this evidence was not just reliable but definitive. Detectives Pinedo and Grantham testified about the investigation, the reopening of the cold case, and the meticulous work that had led them from a decades-old evidence kit to a man living in Florida. The victim herself, now in her 80s, faced the court. For 37 years, she had lived with the trauma of that December night, the attack that no one had been able to solve, the justice that had remained maddeningly out of reach. Commonwealth's Attorney Ashworth later described how the case had long been forgotten about by everyone except the victim, who has had to live with the fear and pain of having been raped, and without any closure on this case until now. Her testimony was a reminder that behind all the scientific advancement and legal proceedings stood a real person whose life had been irrevocably damaged by violence. On August 21, 2025, after hearing all the evidence, the jury began their deliberations. They had to decide whether the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Russell Marubio, and not his identical twin brother, had committed the crimes of abduction and rape on December 19, 1987. They had to evaluate the validity of a scientific technique never before admitted in an American courtroom and determine whether it was sufficient to convict a man of crimes committed nearly 4 decades earlier. The verdict, when it came, was unequivocal, guilty on both counts. Russell Marubio was convicted of the violent abduction and rape of the 50-year-old gas station clerk. The jury had accepted the scientific evidence, understood its implications, and concluded that the prosecution had met its burden of proof. Judge Irving immediately revoked Marubio's bond, and he was remanded to the custody of the Prince William County Sheriff's Office. The man who had walked free for 37 years, who had lived his life while his victim carried the burden of his crime, was finally in custody. The conviction represented a watershed moment in forensic science and criminal justice. As Commonwealth's Attorney Ashworth stated, this landmark case marks the first successful admission and application of this technique in a U.S. court, overcoming challenges that have long prevented DNA identification of identical twins. The case demonstrated that even the most genetically similar individuals could be distinguished through advanced DNA analysis, opening new possibilities for cold cases and future investigations. What had once seemed an insurmountable obstacle, the inability to differentiate between identical twins, had been overcome through persistence, innovation, and cutting-edge science. Russell Marubio's sentencing was scheduled for November 7, 2025, where he would face the consequences of his actions from that cold December night in 1987. The victim, who had waited so long for justice, would finally have closure, knowing that the man who had attacked her had been identified, convicted, and would be punished. Her brother John, whose DNA had also been tested, and who had lived under the shadow of suspicion until the advanced testing cleared him, was exonerated completely. The case serves as a testament to the power of persistence in the pursuit of justice. Detectives Pinedo and Grantham could have left the file closed, accepting that the case was too old and too difficult to solve. The scientists at Parabon Nanolabs could have deemed the challenge of distinguishing identical twins too complex or too risky. The Commonwealth's Attorney's Office could have declined to prosecute, worried about the admissibility of such novel evidence. The victim could have given up hope that she would ever see justice, but none of them surrendered to the difficulties, and their collective determination resulted in not just a conviction, but a revolution in forensic capability. The implications extend far beyond this single case. Cold cases across the country involving identical twins can now be reopened with renewed hope. Future investigations will benefit from the legal precedent established in Prince William County. The technique that distinguished Russell Marubio from his brother will be refined and applied in other contexts, helping to solve crimes that might otherwise have remained unsolvable. What began as a brutal attack in a gas station bathroom in 1987 became a landmark moment in the evolution of criminal justice. For the woman who endured that terrible night, the conviction brought a form of peace that had eluded her for most of her adult life. The man who had violated her, who had stolen her sense of security and left her to live with fear and trauma, had been found and held accountable. The justice system, aided by scientific advancement and dedicated professionals, had finally delivered the answer she deserved. Russell Marubio's face was no longer just that of an unknown attacker from her nightmares, but a real person, identified and convicted, no longer able to hide behind the mirror image of his twin brother. The case of Russell Marubio stands as a reminder that time does not erase accountability, that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, and that the arc of scientific progress, however slow, bends toward truth. In the end, what separated Russell Marubio from his identical twin brother was not appearance or traditional DNA testing, but the microscopic mutations in his genome that made him, in the most fundamental genetic sense, uniquely himself. Those tiny differences, invisible to the eye and undetectable for decades, became the evidence that bridged 37 years between crime and conviction, between violation and vindication. The mirror had finally revealed its edge, and behind it stood not two indistinguishable figures but one guilty man, now facing the consequences he had evaded for far too long.